Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight as we continue our study of Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians. Joining us, as always, is Ken Chapman from Orlando, Florida. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, Jonathan. Doing good. Good to be with you again in this study.
Well, we are right in the middle of chapter 4, and we're trying to keep all of this together as we go through. That's one of the kind of the downsides of having one study a week is you might lose kind of track of where we are, but we're trying to make sure we make connections between each section as Paul is working through his relationship with this congregation. And it's not always easy, especially when some people try to come in and cause problems. And so Paul is trying to deal with these people that he has an issue with. He's also trying to deal with the brethren there in Corinth. And so we are the beneficiaries of the struggle that is going on here as we have Paul's letter to them as he tries to fix this relationship and remind them that it's not about him, it's about the gospel, it's about Jesus Christ. And we'll really see that emphasized in our passage tonight. We will be looking at 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 through 15, and we'll ask Ken to read this for us before we start digging into the text.
We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed, and so I spoke. We also believe, and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God.
So we see in our text here that Paul is going to be emphasizing the idea that what saves us, the focus, the onus here is all on the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ and what he has done. It's not about Paul. And so we start here at the very beginning talking about this treasure. Last week we talked about verses 1 through 6. And in verse 6, the last thing that we talk about is this phrase, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus. And that's really wrapping up some things that he had been talking about. But we see this treasure, this knowledge of Jesus, this gospel, these wonderful things, this life-saving truth. And he says, this is the treasure. And what's interesting is we have this treasure in jars of clay. And the idea here is that clay pots were such common things. They broke easily. You don't replace them. You just make a new one. And you just buy a new one. It's kind of like, Ken, the Dixie cups, the red Solo cups, you don't wash those, you throw them away and get a new one. Although my mom washes them. And so part of the reason they find so much clay or potsherd in archaeology digs is because you just got a new one. You don't worry about fixing it, that kind of thing. You had it everywhere, very common, nothing special about it. Well, that's how the gospel is. The gospel is this great and glorious treasure. And here I am, nothing but a normal guy made from the dust of the ground, carrying around and sharing this treasure. And so Paul starts at the very beginning showing this dichotomy between the message and the messenger. Ken?
I'll ask you a question, Jonathan. What frame is around the Mona Lisa? And I think your answer would probably be, I have no idea.
Yeah, no clue, no clue.
And that's the point, isn't it?
Right.
It's not about the frame, it's about the Mona Lisa. But imagine if you could, building this ornate frame, maybe some LED lights in there flashing. No, it's about, in fact, you could maybe even just say that, leave it frameless, because it's about that. And that to me illustrates what Paul is talking about here. It's all about the gospel. And this is really what he talked about in the first epistle. You remember in chapter 2, when he said, I determined when I came to you to come to you in fear and in weakness and in trembling. That, this is 1 Corinthians 2, verse 5, that your faith may not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Now, one thing he may be doing here, again, we've got this one-sided conversation that we're privy to, is he may be subtly answering, or maybe not so subtly, answering some accusations about Paul's weakness, right, that he was weak in flesh, but bold in his letters, as he talks about. And so he may be saying, you're right, but that's on purpose, and that's intentional. And I think one thing we have to point out in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that there's nothing implied here that Paul was a weak speaker. Paul is doing this intentionally. He is stepping back so that the gospel might be on the forefront. And that's a theme that he repeats throughout both of these epistles.
Right, exactly. And so he says, he continues this theme. You have this wonderful treasure in this lackluster jar of clay, in order to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Your salvation is not dependent upon the eloquence of Paul. And that's why you're saying he takes a step back almost and presents it like that. And so, Ken, we both know Brother D. Bowman. We know other great orators, other great preachers of the gospel. But it is not the eloquence of D. Bowman that saves souls. And D would obviously be the first to say that as well. He has such a good way to say things. He is a wordsmith. But it's not that which saves us. And at the end of the day, D, Paul, me, you are just jars of clay, and we're emphasizing the gospel. And so if you could barely speak English and just put a few words together, as I said this, Kevin from The Office, in the episode where he stops talking in full sentences, comes to mind. Why say lot word when few word do trick? If you spoke English like that, the gospel would still be what saves you. And that's the point that he's making here. And so he's going to go on to elaborate. Ken, you mentioned his weakness, but the Corinthians also would have seen weakness in the fact that he's been arrested, and he's been beaten, and he's been stoned, and he probably has a limp, and he probably has a messed up back. He's going to tell the Galatians that his eyes, maybe he has some trouble with his eyes. And so he's going to emphasize that, yes, those things may be, but it doesn't change the power of the gospel. In fact, it's the gospel that keeps it going. And so he begins here, and I'm going to list all 4 of these together. You can see the contrast between the yellow and the blue here. Nothing special about the colors, just to make the contrast. We are afflicted in every way. And that's Paul. He's afflicted in every way, but he's not crushed. And that's because of Jesus Christ. We have the same idea. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. One said we are stressed, but not stressed out. Probably a little too modern for us there. But Paul, the man, is perplexed, but because of the gospel, he's not at wit's end. We are persecuted, but because of the gospel, we're not alone. We are struck down, but because of the gospel, we are not destroyed, especially with this last one. I think of Paul being stoned, and they left him for dead, but he wasn't destroyed. And to be honest, even if he had died, the gospel had already been preached. The seed had already been sown. And so the gospel is still going to retain its power, even when the jar of clay is destroyed. broken, cracked, however you want to think about that. And he continues here with this same idea. Well, first, Ken, let me ask: do you have any thoughts about those four things he lays out there? It's a very poetic construction that we have here. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm at a loss to whether we want to focus in upon the individual statements that are made, or whether Paul's point is just virtually repetitious for
Right.
emphasis sake, that he's just basically saying we have a modern day expression that we're down but not out.
Right.
And that's that same, I think that's the same concept that he's getting across. And to me, this ties back to the section that we looked at last Monday night when he said, we do not lose heart.
Right.
And so we're not giving up. We have every reason to give up if we lived on human standards, but we do not lose heart, or as we would say, we're not giving up,
Right.
no matter what is happening to us, because it's not about us, it's about the treasure.
Right. And to emulate Paul's repetition here, you gave your example of a phrase, maybe the phrase, we've lost the battle, but we haven't lost the war. And I say that because as we continue through the text here, you're going to see how Paul is extremely repetitive throughout this section, but it helps us to get the point. And I think this is a major point, especially to us today, as we kind of hold Paul in such high regard. I wonder if Paul might even be almost annoyed about the amount of volumes that are written about him. Because he would have just said, whoa, it's not me. I've done nothing. But Paul could make that distinction, and he wants the Corinthians to make this distinction. They were putting so much emphasis on the messenger. They were putting so much emphasis on the jar of clay, or as Ken's analogy, the frame around the Mona Lisa, that they kind of were missing the point. And so Paul is going to continue here, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. Now, this is a strange phrase because Paul's not dead. And so maybe it seems to be a reference to the physical maladies that Paul has because of his preaching of the gospel. Is that how you would read that, Ken?
Well, I think I see two possible interpretations. Number one is the sentence of death was always potentially over Paul's head. At any time it could happen. But also he was kind of, although history doesn't necessarily bear it out exactly this way, Paul was dying a death of 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, that's true.
And when he gets to chapter 4 and chapter 11, he's going to list those. It was the Galatian brethren, wasn't that he talked about, I bear in my body the marks.
Right.
And I think that literal, that he had the scars. And so he was dying this. Again, Paul in another place talked about him being poured out as a drink offering. And I think he's just saying, I'm dying. This is killing me. Yeah. Preaching the gospel is killing me. Yeah. That's the way I take it.
Yeah. I like both of those ideas there. And you see that contrasted in his body, the jar of clay. We see the death of Christ in order, or so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our bodies. And seems to be the reference to the resurrection here, is it not? That we talk about the death of Christ, and now we talk about the life of Christ here, and the good news of the resurrection. But you don't get that without the death, and Paul is bearing that in his body. Paul talks a lot about carrying his cross, and it's almost not in some morbid or sadistic way, but it was almost like Paul was trying to get to that point of having his own cross. And he knew that was part of his mission. And Jesus even tells Ananias in Acts chapter 9, I will show him what he must suffer. It's kind of interesting that Paul still signed on to the mission with that. So we have that statement, and then we're going to see almost the same exact statement. Again, we're just talking about the treasure in the jars of clay. We haven't changed subject here. He says now, this time, he says, for we We who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. Ken, is he saying anything different there? Or is it just some parallelism? He's saying the same thing a different way. Maybe now is he including others who are preaching the gospel? What do you think?
It seems to me that he is just repeating himself, not literally he's saying the same thing in a different way, but that has an impact.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we have to do that. We repeat it for number one purpose is to make sure you get it, but also for emphasis sake. If I say something 2 or 3 times, the audience is saying, well, maybe he really means this. And so I think there's some repetition there. I think there's some possible different interpretations of what he's talking about here, is that we who live are being given over to death so that the life may be manifested in our mortal flesh. It could be simply that idea of the transaction of resurrection that he certainly alludes to here, but it can be also the idea that we're dying so that you might live. This is required at Paul's time to preach the gospel. Right. I have to go through this to preach the gospel. And that's the only way you can get the life, is for me preaching the gospel. And so I'm having to die so that you can receive the life from the gospel gives.
We'll emphasize that, but in the next to last line, he says, it is all for your sake. Paul is being wrung through the ringer on behalf of these brethren. And the grief they give him, they should be ashamed of it. And he's kind of laying that out there on the line for them. And so Paul's going to say it a third time. So death is at work in us. I don't think we're thinking about sin and death here. I think he's talking about literal death. This would not be a Romans 7 parallel or anything like that here. This death, this physical death, is at work. Like you said a minute ago, he's continually dying because of what he's doing. But life in you, and he's doing this for them, and that's why when you get over to the end of the book, Paul can say something like, "I am willing to spend and be spent on your account," because he, like Jesus did on the cross, and let his blood pour out. Paul's letting his life pour out. Not in the same sacrificial manner, but in the way to teach the brethren. He is also giving his life so that the message of Jesus' sacrifice gets out there. Then we change direction a little bit. We're not just emphasizing the same idea over and over here. Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed, and so I spoke. We also believe, and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. If you look at the quote here, we're quoting, seems to be from Psalm 116 at verse 10, and the psalmist is bemoaning his situation. But he says, as many psalms of lament do, they begin with lament and complaint and that kind of a thing, but they end often in praise with statements of trust. And so Psalm 116 verse 10 says, I believed even when I said, I am greatly afflicted. I believed. I trusted in God. And so now Paul says that I have that same level of faith, that I believed as well, even maybe through the beatings, through all these things that are happening. I still believed. Ken, what do you think about this quote here, this phrase?
It's a little perplexing to me. And we just have to admit that sometimes New Testament writers, for lack of a better way of saying it, took liberties with quoting the Old Testament scriptures. Now, we need to preface that by saying that was the Holy Spirit doing it, and he has every right to do that. I do not. And so, yes, he kind of changes the meaning of that phrase, because the psalmist seems to be talking about, I spoke in prayer, or I spoke to you. And now Paul takes it and turns it not speaking to God in prayer, but speaking to another in preaching the gospel. But and so to me, it's a word of caution here of saying that every time a New Testament writer quotes something from the Old Testament, that he's incorporating everything in that context and all of that. Sometimes maybe that's the case, but sometimes it's not. And this to me doesn't seem to be one of those. He just simply saying, just like he believed and he spoke in prayer, I believe, and so I spoke. And maybe it's just the idea that I couldn't help but speak.
Right.
Faith forced me to open my mouth and say something, whether to God, as the psalmist meant it, or to my fellow man, as Paul means it.
And we shouldn't be surprised by that usage of the Old Testament. We do the same thing. And we'll even say, I'm taking this passage out of context, but the wording works for me. We're just borrowing the wording maybe. And so we shouldn't be too surprised that that kind of a thing happens with them. Us preachers, we often like to use whatever translation of the Bible we use to make our point, right? You normally preach out of the New King James, right?
Yeah.
But that if the New American Standard says something you like better, then we'll quote it out of the New American Standard. I don't guess you're ever quoting out of the ESV, are you, Ken?
Not if I can help it.
Only
for this.
Only for this one.
Yeah.
Only for this one. All right. He comes down to the end of this and he says, for it is all for your sake. Everything he's enduring. Let's go back to those lines. Afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. All of these things are happening so that he can get the good news of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ to as many people as possible. And now they're going to turn around and be like, well, you know what? You walk funny because you've been beaten. You were just in jail. I don't know if we want to listen to you or not. And Paul says, all of this has been for your sake. Why do you think I'm doing this? Paul's not really getting anything physical out of it. Paul's not the beneficiary of this in this life. And he says, for it is all for your sake. And then I think he says, and also we need to remember that as grace extends more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. And so Paul says the more that God's grace is distributed, there's not a limited amount that has to be rationed. The more that God's grace is distributed, the more it turns into the glory of God. And Paul would say at the end of the day, that's what it's about, that God get the glory due him. Ken?
Yeah, that phrase, for it is all for your sake. Paul is building to something here, and we can see it coming, and maybe the Corinthians could too. It makes me think of maybe a parental lecture, as your parents tear into this lecture and they use some kind of phrase and you go, oh, I know where you're going with that. That's going to come back later.
Yeah.
And Paul's doing that here. He's already done it, and he's building really to the point at the end of this letter, or near the end of the letter, and saying, shame on you. I'm doing all of this for your sake. And when these accusations are leveled against me, I have to come to my own defense. Yeah. When you should have, to quote the great theologian Barney Fife, you should have nipped it in the bud.
Right.
You should have been the first ones to say, that's wrong. That's right. Not the Paul we know. You should have squashed these rumors, these accusations. You should have come to our defense, and I'm having to do it. And really, shame on you, because everything that I've done and every accusation leveled against me has been for your sake and for the sake of the gospel. And shame on you that I'm having to be the one to defend it.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's our text for tonight. We've already talked about this phrase here, and we will continue next Monday night at 6:30. Ken will lead us in that study, as we're going to have to make a transition over a chapter break. We don't like doing that, but sometimes the text, the sections just demand it. So Ken will take care of us take care of it next week, and we hope to see you then.